Fanfiction is a vital part of fandom, much like the shipping that I talked about previously. It just helps build and foster a community of people that all enjoy a certain thing and allows them a certain avenue to talk about these things. Fanfiction holds a lot of functions in online communities, in particularly on certain subsects of the internet, that being fanfiction.net and a couple other sites. Now, fanfiction can range from fantasy fulfillment to stories that kind of shape out the world that these characters inhabit, essentially making new stories that fit within canon that just allow for more storytelling in the universe. These stories in them of themselves have become hallmarks of internet history, part of the lexicon of how we talk about things on the internet today. No one can argue the oddly captivating, manic state of Chris Chan or the weird, eccentric writings of something like a My Immortal. There's just something incredibly amazing and captivating about these strange characters and people that seem to make these stories. Heck, for example, the stories of Chris Chan are filled with self-insert original characters and weird, nonsensical plot lines. But that work is an extension of him, and it allows us this odd peek into this man's life. It might not be Pulitzer Prize winning literature, but there's something to be said about this that is really a whole lot more interesting than I think a lot of people seem to give it credit for. Again, looking back at Chris Chan, you know, this kind of gives us this look at a manic and sad and, you know, just tragic character of the internet, just taken up by people who find him oh so interesting and entertaining to mess with. But again, there is something incredibly amazing about fanfiction and people's ability to come up with new stories based in the worlds that they love. Many of these do fit within fiction, and some of them, yeah, are fantasy fulfillment, but you really can't argue how important fanfiction is, especially when some of the greatest human achievements actually belong to fanfiction. That's right, there is actually a story called The Subspace Emissary World Conquest sitting at over 4 million words. Guys, this is the single longest work of fiction in human history. For perspective, it's 6 times longer than War and Peace. And if you've read War and Peace, you know that's really, really long. Subspace Emissary World Conquest is 1, a mouthful of a title, but 2, is also a very mouthy and wordy piece filled with flowery dialogue about the struggles of these characters in Smash Bros. It features Chris, a self-insert OC character, the author that we get exposed to this Nintendo-themed battle world that he essentially gets thrust into. You know, he's living a normal life until it's changed forever when he meets a abnormally large Lucario who becomes his best friend. So basically the story is about young and vulnerable Chris and the stoic protector Lucario as they go and meet other Nintendo characters and defend our universe from the subspace emissaries' wish to conquest everything. I said that weird, but I'm not gonna record it again. Honestly, if it wasn't for the Nintendo window dressing of this story, it would really just be a certain type of science fiction novel. You know, if anything, I read some of this book and it just kind of sounded like I was reading The Last Starfighter. Which honestly is a compliment to the writer and overall this story as a whole, aside from the fact that it is so incredibly massive. And you know, I think a lot of people look at fanfiction and they go, this is cringy. And you know, within reason they're saying it's cringy. It makes sense, it definitely is. But let's be real here, this is how a lot of young writers actually get started on their writing careers. Now, I could talk about this, but today I actually have a guest who would do a much better job explaining and talking about that than I can. 404 Tales is a wonderful hybrid of entertainment, education, and talk about the internet. He's an animator, and a lot of his content just oozes with personality. You should give him a stub, but first off, let me give it over to him and just let him talk about this for a little bit.
Hey, thanks, Diesel. So, in my opinion, the best part about a bad fanfiction is that everyone wins. It might not seem like that immediately because, you know, everyone's kind of laughing at one particular person, and at the heart of every bad fanfiction, there's an author who's just so committed to this fantasy in their head that they're willing to sit down and spend hours bringing it to life. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think every story has some kind of wish fulfillment going on, but the thing about bad fanfiction is just that it's a little too obvious. See, what I think makes a good bad fanfiction so good is that we already know who these characters are and how their stories are supposed to go. Any kind of deviation from that is just gonna be super obvious. You know exactly what the author is, contributing to the story. It's like, oh, hey, it's Sonic the Hedgehog. I know that character. Oh, and a purple ninja hedgehog who came from the future named Murderator X. What Sonic the Hedgehog game was Murderator X from again? I don't recall. That's like the main ingredient of bad fanfiction. It's just wish fulfillment. Like one day somebody just said, man, I really like iCarly. It's almost the perfect show. But it doesn't have any giant robots in it, so they just went and made their dreams come true. A Harry Potter fanfiction with more goths, probably written by a goth. A Star Wars fanfiction, but all the women have giant boobs, probably written by someone who really likes big boobs. So when you see someone writing something with previously created characters or in an already established world, you just have to ask yourself which of these things is not like the other, and suddenly you have a pretty clear picture of what the author of that fanfiction is like, and it's not super flattering. So I can see how someone might disagree with me when I say everyone wins when it comes to bad fanfiction. It's pretty clear who the loser is when everyone's laughing at the author of The Simpsons, but Bart is gay for Milhouse, because a big part of what makes these stories so funny to us is the question, oh my god, who wrote this? So yes, we're laughing at people when we're enjoying these terrible stories, but here's the thing that's super, super important to consider. If you're trying to be a writer, you're gonna have to write some terrible stories. It's pretty much a requirement because nobody starts off being great at something. Some people may be more naturally inclined to certain things, or some people may have grown up in an environment where they can improve more quickly, and some people just get better at stuff away from prying eyes, unlike our fanfiction authors here. But all of them started off being terrible. So you want to be a great author. You have so many great stories you want to tell, so many original characters that you want to create, but you're weighed down by this fear, this knowledge that you're just bad. That no matter how many great characters you have planned out, no matter how many worlds you've dreamt up, everything is just going to turn to crap once you put it down on paper. And the bad news is, you're probably right. At least to some degree. But what if I told you that there were already created characters and scenarios ready for you to use and abuse? A fictional world that not only could survive your shitty writing, but also came with a built-in audience that could provide you with necessary feedback. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that writing bad fanfiction is going to make you a better writer, but I can definitely tell you that it's the least painful way to learn how to write. On a deeper level, maybe one of the reasons we enjoy laughing at bad fanfiction is because we get a certain sense of relief from it. Oh man, thank God I'm not this person, but really, these folks aren't that bad off. A lot of them are pretty young when they write these, or maybe they're just doing it as a hobby, or hell, maybe they just really want to see iCarly pilot a giant robot. You might pity them, or think they're just embarrassing themselves, but at the end of the day, you get better at something by doing it. It doesn't matter if you're writing about how you're Spider-Man's secret girlfriend, you're still writing. And my god, you wouldn't believe just how many professionals there are out there who got started writing fanfiction. Did you know the best-selling book series of all time was originally a fanfiction? All E.L. Grey had to do was take her Twilight fanfiction, tweak it just a little, and bam, you have 50 Shades of Grey. And I can understand if you don't want to make your own 50 Shades of Grey, but consider this. Donald Glover, aka Childish Gambino, aka the guy who created the award-winning show Atlanta, he got his first job in television by writing what he thought would make for a good episode of The Simpsons. So yeah, in my opinion, whenever a new terrible fanfiction becomes popular, I think it's something worth celebrating. It means there are people still out there trying to make something good. They're failing spectacularly, of course, but maybe that's not how their story ends. Maybe one day they can figure out a way to make Murderator X the Hedgehog a beloved character. They just gotta keep writing. Oh, and for the love of God, use a fake name so you don't end up embarrassing yourself when you're creating new content. I'm 404 Tales, and back to you, FPS Diesel. Thanks again for this opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Jack. Now, remember to go check out 404 Tales down in the description below and make sure to subscribe to him. Help my brother out. go send him some love over to his channel. Okay, guys, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Make sure to tell him that the Boomer sent you. You know, I think if there's one way that flops of these novellas make careers, it's with something like My Immortal, which 404 sent me a article that essentially really changed my perspective on My Immortal. So for the longest amount of time, everyone on the internet speculated over who made this hilariously awful story with Harry Potter. They speculated over the identity of this Tara character, the titular author and somehow weird, omnipotent character of this story. Well, it turns out that Tara actually doesn't exist. Tara is actually Rose Christo, an author. Now, Rose wrote a series of stories called the Give Light series, right? And My Immortal was, in a sense, one of her first works. My Immortal, more specifically, is something that Rose wrote as kind of a fantasy fulfillment in her teens when she was in foster care. Now, the story is obviously a lot deeper than what I am saying to you now, and is probably told better by Rose's memoir than me kind of giving a retelling of the articles. But she and Raven, her friend and co-author, ended up writing My Immortal. In fact, they wrote My Immortal on a school computer and took the story with them on a $5 USB that they bought at Best Buy. Humble beginnings for one of the greatest pieces of fiction that I have ever read. My Immortal, in a sense, essentially becomes a catalyst for Rose to try and reconnect with her brother that she lost through foster care. It was really humble beginnings and an interesting start to an entire writer's career. Right here, we can see the wish fulfillment of My Immortal, but we can also see the character and the building of a person behind the story, which I think makes My Immortal even more interesting and more reason to look at it in less than just a funny haha way, and more of a how did this change and impact a person's life kind of way. Hey, post-production Diesel here. Anyway, so I wanted to come back and actually give some further notes about what's happening with Rose Christo, even if that is her real name. So it turns out that maybe she was lying about the whole foster care thing. Yeah, I know, that sounds pretty fucking bad. In fact, it was really hard for me to corroborate any evidence because most of it comes from forum posts and discussions, basically talking about her identity and what it was really like. Essentially, My Immortal was made as a troll fic to get her into the community to use its resources to help her find her brother. Now, I don't know how true that is. It doesn't seem to make a lot of logical sense. Granted, these are teenagers we are talking about, but for that to be the same story that an adult is telling and saying that is a logical line of thinking is kind of strange. Anyway, as a result of these claims, they actually ended up canceling Rose's memoir, and as a result, she was taken off the release list, and most people are very conflicted on whether or not she even wrote the book in the first place. My professional opinion, or unprofessional I guess, is that, yeah, Rose wrote the fic, and it may actually just be a troll fic, but Rose may or may not have been in foster care. Apparently, according to her alleged brother, those claims of abuse are extremely exaggerated and that she doctored proof and evidence of everything that happened to her in her life, specifically so she could get the book off the ground and make it a New York Times bestseller. It's interesting because they let kind of their personality spill onto the pages of their fanfiction. And again, I think this is most perfectly exemplified with people like Chris Chan. You know, people like Chris Chan have developed full communities around them just because of how strange and captivating their personalities are. And in fact, the people who watch Chris Chan and watch his every move are called Christorians. Yes, that's what they're called. And by the way, for the unfamiliar, I should probably get you caught up on who Chris Chan is just a little bit. So their real name is Christopher Weston Chandler. Now, Chris penned an infamously strange OC into their story known as Sonichu, a medallion that you have probably seen this character wear from time to time. Basically, it's where this Sonic Pikachu hybrid is the hero, but Sonichu kind of falls to the background as Chris himself becomes the main protagonist of the story in their CWC fill. Yes, the town is named after his initials. You know, he beds women in graphic detail. His own character beds women. Women that may exist or may not exist, really depending on the day. He fights villains in his stories who are most often based off of his own life, one of which was even a shadow version of himself, which was a weird real-world story arc where someone pretended to be Chris Chan in order to make Chris Chan angry. Chris also changed his name from Christopher to Christian, and here's why. This happened when an animatronic mole bear kind of misheard his name as a Christian when he said his name was Christopher. Chris heard Leonard Bernstein say this and assumed it was him saying by some divine means that his name must be changed to Christian from Christopher. Christian eventually transitioned from being Christian to being Christine Weston Chandler. And when he did this, he called himself lesbian identified male. I also don't know what that means. Eventually, though, he did say that he was a trans woman. Now, there's a CWC wiki that essentially chronicles the entire life of Chris Chan, his stories, his trials, his everything. And one could argue that the wiki in itself is a non-linear story that tells the entire story of this man's life. And, like, when Chris Chan does not exist anymore, he will live on as this non-linear, engaging character of the internet. And all of this happened because he wrote a weird fanfiction. Now, Chris is one special example of having this kind of special link with the characters in his stories, but there are other, a little more nefarious and dangerous cult of personality-like characters that have developed strange followings in the fanfiction fandoms. I think one of these stories that exemplifies that pretty well is the Final Fantasy House, something that many of you may have heard in the past. I know Down the Rabbit Hole did a video about it, and I'm going to recommend that. I'm using it as a source here, actually, but let me give you a brief overview. So imagine a cult developed around the idea of Final Fantasy. Joanna was that cult leader. Living in a derelict apartment, anyone who came through there had to adjust to Joanna's way of life. A very interesting and strange way of life that would essentially uproot any kind of semblance you had to normal society. For example, anyone who stayed in the Final Fantasy house had to change their name to the name of one of the Final Fantasy characters that Joanna saw within them, because Joanna has that special power that allows her to see what they are on the inside. Joanna would tell her followers about their reincarnation in past lives from when they were Final Fantasy characters, of course. Now, and this is according to Joanna, but she could channel Final Fantasy characters within herself. She would use this to, in turn, urge her members to hook up, because they were, you know, just an OTP, they were the ship from Final Fantasy, or they were in an actual relationship in the game. Fandom cults are really rare, but they've actually happened multiple times, and they kind of go part and parcel with the things that we see in modern day and, you know, pre-internet Scientology. For some reason, when you write this fiction, people get kind of like a cult-like mentality built around it, and we're going to talk about another character that is also really interesting, and I just find very strange, but let's move on. Now, Andrew Blake is a cult of personality that I have never seen a single one like in my entire life. I have not seen a character with this in any other online community, and obviously if you're a fan of this channel, you've seen me cover lots of online communities by now. Andrew Blake could be his own story, and, you know, very well might be in the future, but I'm gonna give a brief overview of him as well. What Andrew believes is that people like J.R.R. Tolkien and various other writers are actually not writing fiction, but channeling characters, people, who exist in alternate realities. In short, what Andrew is saying is that these stories are real, and the events actually happened, but they take place in a reality completely removed from ours, a parallel dimension. Now, of course, Andrew was also one of these channelers, but he is more powerful than the previous, the most powerful channeler, actually. Now, he used this and his kind of personality and writing skills to bring people into his orbit, to bring them into his circle. And of course, Andrew can also detect when other people can channel. no matter how far removed their power from channeling is, he can sense when it's inside you. You know, he and the followers that initially gravitated towards him developed a pamphlet called the Mind Hole. It was essentially a recruitment tool, a list of series, rules, and ideas in order to bring people in to their circle. Guys, his students called him things like fearless leader, so I think you should know where it goes from here. He would use things like your favorite character from Harry Potter to be a medium of sorts in between Harry and you in the real world, to kind of build a certain trust and believability with the people who enjoy his work. Now again, with Andrew, this is a really short kind of overview of his ideology and what he did with fanfiction, but, and I mean this in the most sincere way, but the activities that Andrew partakes in with his fans and his people, even though his power has certainly faded into kind of internet obscurity, is that Andrew is kind of like a cult leader. You know, it has the trappings of a cult. It really does. I'm not saying it was a cult, but it does exhibit some cult-like behavior, and all groups do to an extent have certain cult-like behaviors. And for example, what I'm gauging the idea of what is cult-like behavior or not, I'm using the Byte extremism model to determine what is and isn't cult-like. I'll leave a link to that down below as well, but just so you know. At the end of the day, fanfiction is really important to how internet communities operate online. I think a lot of people would disagree with that, but it allows us kind of this window into what kind of conversations are important to a fandom and how that fandom interacts, especially if that fandom isn't really around anymore. These stories are representations of how these people interact online, and I think that's really interesting. Fanfictions are not only a reflection of the communities, but of the people who are writing them, of course. These stories tend to be more personal because they'll fill out the negative aspects of their personality and the wish fulfillment. I do actually think it'll be important for internet scholars that will exist someday that they look at and examine the tropes related to fanfiction, because these tropes and these ideas expressed in fanfiction will tell us a lot about these people and how they interacted online. So in a sense, this video is kind of me gauging an awareness for fanfiction and internet kind of cultural studies in general. But with that being said, thank you to 404 Tales for lending his talents to this video. Please guys, make sure to go check out his channel down in the link below. There'll also be one of those like card things after we get to the outro, so that way you can go check out his channel. He's a really good guy, very talented, and I like a lot of what he does. I'd like to see him do it more, so please do send him some love. Go subscribe to his channel. In the meantime, if you guys have any further questions about anything I discussed in this video, I will be answering questions for a bit over on Twitter, so you can go hit me up at FPS Diesel. I can usually see everything in my mentions anyway, so go hit me up with your questions. Hopefully they're good questions. Anyway guys, in the meantime, make sure to follow me over there on FPS Diesel as well. But yeah, take care.